likely is it, do you think, that we do actually get some sort of legislation, and soon?
Oh, I think there will definitely be legislation. I think this is Mark Zuckerberg's life for the next 10 years. And Google and others, they have built the most powerful media and communications platforms in the history of the world. A lot of ramifications of that. The government is starting to get involved. They did not get in front of these issues fast enough on their own, so now they're going to get regulated. And I think that what we're seeing is them trying to be able to have as much control over that future regulation as possible by being in front of the people who are going to do it.
Paul, do you think this marks a turning point for someone like Mark Zuckerberg to be going and meeting with some of his, quite frankly, fiercest critics in Congress and having these conversations and trying to get ahead of some of this regulatory change?
Nailed it. I think all these groups, they built incredibly powerful organizations and companies, and they have a huge role in society now. And they're behind the curve and really have been caught to some extent by surprise on how quickly some of these sort of governmental organizations, particularly Europe and even China, have gone towards more work around privacy and consumer protection.
Henry, I'm skeptical. I mean, I asked Senator Warner, what can the Senate realistically get done, and what would he prioritize? He did say election security, but, I mean, the way Mitch McConnell versus the Democrats has been going, I question whether they can even get that done.
This would seem to be somewhat bipartisan. It's not just Democrats who are at least worried about what's going on. Just look at how regulated other industries are. The telecommunications industry, the original media industry before these companies came along, utilities, unbelievable legislation around them, what they can do, what they can't do. And this is going to take a long time. There's not going to be some blanket law that will suddenly fix it forever. But these issues are going to keep coming up, and my guess is Congress will keep doing little things to try to head them off.
Paul, if we do get some sort of legislation here, and I realize a lot of it could and would at least initially center around the big tech companies, is there a concern that you could see regulatory creep? And I ask that because if you're trying to stoke competition, you're trying to stoke innovation, then it could make it harder for smaller companies to become more formidable competitors.
Yeah, I think what you're going to see is a dynamic that's occurred over quite a long period of time now. You've got they're kind of opposing forces here. There's sort of the West techno-optimism, idealistic look at the world. Hey, let's just kind of put products out there. If people like our products, they'll use them, including social networks. You've got more of the East. I think Henry did a good job of paraphrasing this notion of like, hey, we're all used to being regulated. You should be regulated too. And you've also got young versus old. I cringe every time I hear a politician attempt to try to capture something around new technology and how they're going to regulate new technology. Go back to the internet as a set of tubes type of comment that we used to get out of Congress. So it's not just the companies that are behind on this. The bureaucrats and the regulators fall behind on these new technologies as they come out. Eventually they catch up, and then once they catch up, then the entrepreneurs figure out another new line to open up communication out and offerings and products out to consumers. And the cycle just kind of happens over and over again. And I think this is just the latest version of it.
Well, turning now to Bob Iger, in an excerpt from his coming memoir, the Disney CEO saying that if Steve Jobs was still alive, Disney and Apple would have likely merged. Of course, now you have the two companies fighting over content in an ever-crowded streaming space. Henry, we've had this debate over and over again about whether Apple, if they really meaningfully want to get into content and really want to make a splash with streaming, that maybe they should consider an acquisition. Does this close the door on what could have been one of the most or was one of the most talked about possible acquisitions over the years?
So Bob Iger used a very nice euphemism there. We would have merged. Let's say what actually would have happened. Apple would have bought Disney, and there would have been one CEO, and I would respectfully suggest it would have been Steve Jobs. And I would say, as an Apple shareholder, thank goodness they didn't do that. It would have been a bad idea then. It's a bad idea now.
Why?
Apple does not need to own a massive content company. And the moment they do, they immediately change the landscape with all of the other content companies whose content they may want to put through their pipes and so forth. They want to do a big deal with Disney. Go do a big business deal with Disney. the vertical integration strategy that media and distribution companies have tried since the dawn of time actually doesn't work that well.
You think antitrust would have gotten in the way of it ever happening?
I just think it would have been a bad idea, and I think ultimately Steve Jobs was extremely smart about these things, and I think he would have realized, like, if I buy Disney and then I want to do something big with Time Warner, I've put myself in a bad position. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. People want it to, but it doesn't.
Paul, is it an example to you of Apple's discipline?
I think it's exactly right. Once again, Henry nailed it. Apple is one of the most disciplined, if not the most disciplined company on the planet in terms of how they operate. If you look at even something like an iTunes, that was a very small company acquisition made nearly 20 years ago that has now blossomed into being a big, big part of the business and the App Store and all the other things that have kind of happened there. Apple makes relatively small, important, but tactical acquisitions along the way. Had they diluted their brand and their power and their global logistics advantages, all the other things that they do so well in a very, very difficult space, combining hardware and software, they're the best in the world at doing that. I think anything they would have done to buy somebody on the content side, especially a fading media company, would have been a complete disaster. And I completely agree with Henry. I would have been very disappointed had I owned shares in Apple had they done that deal. Had they done that deal, Steve Jobs would have run the combined company. Maybe it would have turned out to be something interesting as a result of that, but that's not the way history's played out.
I'm not sure Steve Jobs would have bought Disney, but it's interesting to me at least that Bob Iger, it seems, would have sold Disney. That's interesting.